Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about aerodynamics. Are you a non-STEM, non-racer like me who has wondered about the basic principles of aerodynamics as it relates to Formula One? If so, this conversation is for you. As you'll hear, I had a ton of questions and Dick did his best to simplify a very complicated aspect of Formula One. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Dick, we're going to do another one of these F1 Tech Talks. Not TikTok, Tech Talk. Aerodynamic 101 or Aero 101s. For the people like me that are listening that are non-STEMs, and this is all way, like, it just freaks me out slightly. But then you have done such a great job with all the other content of making this approachable. And I think that the audience will be very, what's the word? Enriched by the fact that you are simplifying it for us dummies. And so for the audience, if you have questions, I tell you now, feel free to throw them my way. Hopefully I'm asking the questions that you all are asking, because it feels like a whole foreign language, a whole new world that I'm trying to understand. But it's so cool because I realize that this is the stuff that we don't understand as the general listener or viewer of F1, how important what you're about to explain to us, which is...
But no pressure on me whatsoever.
Of course not, because you're like the genius. You're able to totally do this. Yes. We've already seen this. Like I told you that the other day when we did it, one of our other episodes, I walked away going, I actually think I understand, which is an achievement, I have to tell you. So you have a bit of a standard to maintain, but I believe you'll attain it. Okay, so all that there. Are you ready?
I am ready. Bring it.
Okay. Here's the first question. Not hard at all. What are the basic principles of aerodynamics?
So that's sort of like a number of graduate level college courses, but let's keep it like really, really simple. And and let's just think about it from a number of perspectives. The first of all, there are multiple principles at play here when we start talking about aerodynamics. I think one of the more important ones is one that we've already talked about when we were talking about ground effect, which is that primarily there's an old law of science called Bernoulli's principle, and it basically states that a liquid, and in this case the liquid is air, follow me on this one, the liquid will exert less pressure on a surface the faster it moves. So if we think about an airplane wing, and if you look at it not from the top or not from the front, but if you look at it from the side, you'll see that the bottom of the airplane wing is flat, but the top curves at the very beginning at the leading edge of the wing. It curves up, makes a very smooth radius, and then goes back downwards towards the trailing edge of the wing. And so what this means is that if we think about an airplane, as it goes down the runway, getting ready to take off, the air is getting faster and faster over the wing and under the wing. Well, as the speed increases at a certain point, the air that's going over the wing really doesn't push down on the wing like it normally would if the airplane was standing still. And remember, we live in an environment, we don't feel it, but air exerts a little over 14 pounds per square inch on us, right? So as that airplane accelerates, that 14 pounds per square inch becomes something less on the top of the wing, whereas it remains constant at the bottom of the wing because it's going at a speed that is actually somewhat slower than the air that's going over the top. Because think about it, that air that's going over the top has to go a further distance because it's going over that curve all the way to the back, because it's got to meet up with the air then at the trailing edge of the wing. So the top air has to meet up at the same time with the air at the bottom as it gets split by the wing. And so depending on the size of the airplane and the size of the wing, if you think about, you've got, let's say, 1,000 square inches of square inches on the top surface of the wing, let's say, and you drop the pressure from 14 pounds to 10 pounds. Well, the bottom is still putting out that 14 pounds per square inch. So on a wing with, an area of 2,000 square inches, let's say, I don't know what the numbers, but you'll see the illustration. the top is now producing 4,000. I'm sorry, it's producing 8,000 pounds less downforce than what's going in underneath the car, and the plane lifts off the ground, okay, or lifts under the wing of the airplane. And so the airplane lifts off the ground, if that makes sense. So it's based on the amount of square inches and the amount of pressure differential between the top of the surface of the wing and the bottom of the surface of the wing. Race car, it works just the opposite. They turn the wing upside down. And so instead of lifting the car off the ground, it squashes the car into the ground, but it's the same principle. Does that make sense?
Actually, it does. And I don't think it ever did until right then.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So to just make it a little bit more complex, because this is where it starts getting fun, is air density also has a massive influence on aerodynamics. Okay. And that can change by the hour. A few years ago, like all the airplanes at Phoenix International Airport were grounded because it was so hot and they couldn't take off. And they were like, oh, because of the heat, they can't take off. Well, actually, yeah, the heat was the cause. But what really was happening is that the heat caused the air density to go down so low that the wings couldn't produce enough lift to get the airplanes off the ground. Well, that same principle also applies to race cars. And so, at Formula One tracks, you could have a day, like Spa, for example, the weather changes there like crazy, right? And you could have a beautiful sunny day on Friday, and it could be cold and rainy on Saturday, right? Well, when that happens, that air density changes. And so the balance of the car will also change because the air density changes. So as your air density goes up, the downforce levels go down. And so to a certain degree, as the downforce levels go down, the race engineers have to crank in more wing to compensate for the fact that there's not as much air density pushing the car down. So that can get really, really tricky, as you can imagine, for some tracks when you're trying to tune the aerodynamics to get the handling just right. And of course, these guys have figured out, in the wind tunnel, hey, when the barometric pressure is 29.92, which is a standard day, this wing produces 2,000 pounds of downforce. But when the barometric pressure drops to 28.8, it produces something less than that. And so they know kind of what the change is as the air density goes up and down. And so you have to adjust it. With all that said,
can I interrupt you just for a second? Because okay, so I think you answered it, but I want to make sure it's clear in my head and maybe for those who are listening. So when you said barometric, because I can't remember air density from science class, was way more long ago than I want to admit. But you're meaning like the pressure of the air, like the
pressure. Yeah, the amount of air pressure that's being exerted just on you. Right.
Like when we know that the air pressure is going up, that's usually when we're going to see rain, right?
No, that's when the skies are going to clear out.
Oh, okay. So it's the other way around. So like when the barometric pressure goes, okay. Yep. All right. So, but that is the barometric pressure. And so you're saying that when the pressure is varying, that is another obviously a variable that the race team has to be thinking about, because it actually affects the aerodynamics on the car itself.
Right.
So
it influences the balance and the amount of downforce.
So like on a day where maybe it's, as you said, hotter, maybe on Friday, but then by Sunday, it's not as hot. You've done your practice sessions and all of that. Then you're kind of going in blind then on Sunday, because if it's changed that dramatically, or the reverse, like it was cooler or not as high pressure. And then by the time you get so that is something that you may or may not be able to foresee, but because of the level of history and data F1 now has on most of the circuits, you can kind of know if that probability is going to happen, I guess.
And they know how the wing will perform in the wind tunnel. And so they're going to know that as the air density changes, they're going to know, okay, I need to add, this additional degrees of flaps. See, because the wings are adjustable. They've got adjustability built into them to, they increase the angle of the wing right? In the case of a race car, that means the leading edge of the wing goes down and the tail of the wing or the trailing edge goes up. And so that increases the downforce. And on the other hand, if it goes the other way, then it reduces the amount of downforce. But let's take that hypothetical situation. You have low air density on Friday, you got high air density on Sunday. So on Friday, to optimize the car, you probably have more wing cranked in. And again, that means the leading edge of the wing is pointing further downward, pushing the car into the road, basically. And then the weather goes cooler, you get more air density. Well, if you leave the wings set there, what happens is that you'll produce more downforce on Sunday than you did on Friday, which is good, but you're also producing more drag, which means you won't be as fast in a straight line. So you have to take wing out of it, which in this case would be, let's raise that leading edge, lower the trailing edge, and take some of the angle out of that wing, whether it's at the front or the back, and usually it's both sides.
But then in our case that we just said, you've got Parc Fermé to deal with. So those are some of the things that even in the first minutes of the race, the team is probably, obviously they are looking at all this leading into the Grand Prix, but in the first minutes of the race, if there was this kind of a variance, they're having to do on the fly adjustments and decisions of where to tactically make that change, and they have to also prepare the driver ahead of time to be making those compensations. So those are some like strategic decisions that we as the audience may not fully grasp unless we have the racing background that you do.
Right. Okay. I mean, an even better example is when the Indy cars are racing at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, right? So, 2.5 mile oval, very, very high speeds. They run much faster there than Grand Prix cars ever go, okay, by a good 20 to 30 miles an hour typically. But their performance window is very, very narrow. They'll go through the corners at, say, 230 miles an hour, but they'll go down the straightaways at 240, 242, something like that, 243. And so that margin, that window between your minimum speed and your maximum speed, very, very narrow. And so at those kinds of speeds, as you can imagine, the cars they're putting out literally tons of downforce. And so if you look at a car that runs at Indianapolis, it has very, very little tiny front wings, really tiny little rear wings. And then they'll go to a road course a week later, and suddenly those cars sprout these massive wings, right? And so for the engineers working on the Indy cars, they've got a couple of tools that they deal with. And one of them is depending on the air density, they may actually tilt the rear wing so that the leading edge of the wing is actually going upwards slightly, which is creating a little bit of lift, believe it or not. But that's because of the ground effects that are being produced, And remember, when we talked about it, the faster you go, the more downforce you make.
Right. Okay. And then we did talk about ground effects, the whole aspect of like Mexico City and how that makes a difference.
Yes.
It sounds like air density would also be part of the equation
Absolutely.
here too, right?
100%.
Okay.
100%.
I am actually connecting some of these dots. That is success in my book. Again, you're doing a great job, Dick. Okay. Awesome. So what are the things that we need to remember then when it comes to Aero?
Yeah. So, you're looking at drag, you're looking at downforce, and you're looking at cooling. And so the engineers are constantly doing this very delicate dance to get their numbers right. And obviously Red Bull in 2023 got it like perfect. They got the perfect amount of downforce against the amount of drag, because as you increase downforce, you also typically will increase drag. But then you also have to cool those engines. And you think about it, that's a very tiny engine, 1.6 liters. It's a hybrid, of course. But between the internal combustion unit, or the ICU, and the hybrid unit itself, they're putting out, call it 1,000 horsepower. Well, there's a whole bunch of heat being generated there. So how do you keep all that cool? And so what you have to do is you've got to push that car through the air, not only the wings and the tunnels and everything else. You've also got a couple of pretty good sized radiators that have to be shoved through the air as well. And so while you worry about, the profile of the floor and the shape of the side pods and the front and rear wings and all those other things, just the ducting for the radiators is another huge deal, because if you get that wrong, those radiators can cause an enormous amount of drag because you're having to shove so much air through a radiator, which is going to slow you down. So it's a big deal.
Is that like some of the stuff that we saw Haas was struggling with? Was that, I feel like ducting was an issue, or am I
Yeah,
imagining that?
yeah, I mean, if you look at a Formula One car from, the late 70s, early 80s, and you look at the size of the radiator inlets, and then
Hmm.
you compare them to the size of the radiator inlets today, the cars today have much smaller inlets, and yet they're designed to, you have air coming in at ambient temperature, it goes to the radiator, it heats up, and so that air, because it's heated up, it started to expand. So how you shape the exhaust of those radiator ducts
Hmm.
is everything towards, because you can actually, there's been times when, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, where they actually have figured out, okay, I can accelerate the air coming out of the radiator
Hmm.
because of the difference in the temperature. And
Hmm.
so it actually creates, in air quotes, thrust.
I see. Yeah, you're like leveraging what should be a problem to actually become a benefit for
Right.
you. Like
Exactly.
it's solving. Okay. 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 All right. So you said this earlier that this is the plane, like there's a lot of similarities. So essentially, is it really an inverse of everything in the plane that we think of when it comes to aerodynamics when we look at the Formula 1 or just racing in general, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially you have to think of it as an airplane that's flying really, really low to the ground. And of course we don't want it to take off. It's never really worked before, right?
Fernando did
No.
that a few years ago at Coda. We didn't like that.
Yeah, yeah, he got an assist, but I mean, yes, he did. Yeah, he did fly. Um, so that's very correct. And just like an airplane, you have that compromise between downforce or lift in the case of the airplane and drag. And again, remember, typically, if you, it's not always, but typically, if you increase downforce, then you're also increasing drag. And so the trade-off is, as you increase downforce, you're going to be able to go through the corners quicker because the car sticks in the corners better. However, you're going to be slower down the straightaways. So that's where the compromise is. And just to give you an example, years and years ago, when we did not have wind tunnel information and all that, I was engineering some cars that were called Formula 2000 cars, and they look just like a Formula One car. It's just they don't have as big engines and they're not as sophisticated, but they are open cockpit, open wheel cars, mid-engine. They have front and rear wings, diffusers, all that kind of fun stuff. And what we wound up doing is that anytime we went to a track in practice, we'd just keep adding wing to the car until the lap time started slowing down. And then we would back off the wing and go back to the previous setting. And that was where we would stay. And that's how we did it. Not sophisticated, but it worked.
Oh, that is so cool. That's actually a question I was going to ask you because I did know that the wind tunnel and I think what is it, CFD
Safety.
are technological tools that are used to help us in this whole aerodynamics assessment. And I was wondering, what did they do before that? And now to
Mm-hmm.
hear it's just keep going. And then, oh,
Yeah.
that's a little too far. Let's bring it back just a little.
Yep.
That's so cool. I love that. Like, I
Yep.
don't want to say rudimentary, but like, I guess that's the only word I can think
Yeah,
of.
I mean that's really what it was, and I mean, like the wing profiles themselves. Um, back in prior to NASA, there was an organization called NACA, NACA, which is National Aerospace Committee of America or something like that. And this was sort of 1940s, 1950s, and they had done a whole bunch of studies and had designed a whole bunch of different wing profiles that worked depending on the speed that the airplane was supposed to go. So for a slow airplane, they would have a certain wing profile, and for a faster airplane, it would look something different. It would be a narrower profile, and then for a supersonic, it became something even different, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
race car designers, because they at the time they didn't really have wind tunnels and all that, or if they did, the wind tunnels were pretty crude. What they would do is they would say, look, I need an airplane wing that works really good between 150 and 200 miles an hour. And they'd go out to their NASA or their NACA book, that basically shows what the chord and the radius of the wing looks like, and they would copy that, and that's what they'd put on the car.
Oh,
Yeah, you wouldn't put a supersonic wing on there, right?
right.
Because you're only doing 150, 200 miles an hour, but you put, something that you might see on a, oh, I don't know, like a Cessna 172 that's not going to go real fast. Yeah, it's probably going to work. Yeah.
When did Aero first really become a serious consideration in the world of F1?
Yeah, probably about the time F1 first came about, when Grand Prix racing started to become a thing, and that was in the 1920s. And it was interesting because designers both in Europe and in the United States, because by this time, of course, they were racing at Indianapolis too, right? They all decided that, for whatever reason, they decided that a narrow, bodywork with the wheels sticking out in the air was more efficient than having the wheels tucked away under fenders, which, today we would know that's not necessarily true. But that was the creation of open wheel racing cars, and that's why Grand Prix cars have always been open wheeled. But, we got through the Great Depression and World War II, and so Formula One officially became a thing. And if you look at those cars, they were all front engine, and again, open wheeled. But what was interesting is they evolved into having body work that was shaped kind of like a cigar, or maybe a torpedo would be the best way to put it, because nobody really had thought about downforce at that stage. And so their whole deal was, let's make this thing as fast as possible in a straight line. And that's what we're going to go do. Toward the end of the 1960s, a guy named Jim Hall, who was a Texas oilman who raced in a series called the Can-Am series, which was for high horsepower sports cars here in the United States. Bruce McLaren competed in that with McLaren, actually, his own car. But it was Jim Hall who came up with the idea of mounting an upside down airplane wing on the back of his race car. It was called the Chaparral. And it suddenly went a whole lot quicker through the corners. It wasn't as fast in a straight line, but it was so much faster in the corners that it was a competitive advantage. He gained more in the corners than he lost on the straightaways. I guess that's the best way to put it. And so Formula One designers started taking notice of what Hall had done, and they began having their Formula One cars start sprouting wings. And this was, in 1968-ish. And but they also began taking advantage of the heated air that was coming out of the radiators. And back in those days, if you look at pictures of cars for one of the real trend-setting cars of 1968 was the Lotus 49. And if you look at it, it had that cigar shape, had a big old hole in the front of the car, and that's where they put the radiator. And then they ducted the air. The air had to go somewhere. They didn't want it blowing on the driver, right? Hot air on the driver, not a good plan. So what they did is they ducted the air out of what they called nostrils at the top side of the bodywork, and that created a little bit of downforce. And funnily enough, once you got to the roll bar, the engine itself was exposed out in the air. And if you looked at the cars from the 1950s, those cars had the engines tucked away and the bodywork and all that kind of jazz. And then for some reason, towards the end of the 60s, those cars literally had their engines just hanging out in the breeze. So not very aerodynamic. But as they started moving into the 70s, they realized, hey, man, there's a whole bunch of air coming over the top of the car. Let's capture that in a big air duct and ram it into the fuel injectors as a sort of a compressed air kind of thing to create more horsepower. And so all the teams started doing that. And then they realized, oh gosh, this really smooths out the airflow to the rear wings. I wonder what would happen if we cleaned up the rest of the, put bodywork around the engines. And sure enough, the cars went faster. And by the way, they looked a whole lot better. And then we discovered ground effects towards the end of the 1970s. And that's when the cars really began to become very tightly packaged and with, really elegant designs. because airflow suddenly became king. It was king before them, but now it was really king.
Does that also correlate with like road cars that we started to realize the same principles could not only look beautiful, but also help in the
Yeah.
car design?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, you see so many, like, take pretty much any sports car, and everybody has arrived at roughly the same shape.
Hmm.
The new Corvette looks kind of like a McLaren, which looks kind of like a Ferrari, which kind of looks like a Lotus,
Hmm.
and so certainly there's design cues that each car has that's going to make it different and unique and all that kind of stuff. But the layout and all that, eventually everybody kind of comes to the same place.
Hmm. Yeah, because I was thinking that the time periods that you're talking about, the cars tended to look boxier
Mm-hmm.
and not, I mean, not that I dislike them, but now, or as the progression in my mind, I was just thinking, yeah, but the cars that we were seeing on the road were also starting to have that sleeker
Mm-hmm.
look. So that's interesting to me about
I would add, one thing to think about is like if you think about the cars that raced in 1976,
mhm,
ground effect had not taken hold. And so if you look at the Ferrari that Niki Lauda drove that year, it had what was called a flat 12 engine. It had 12 cylinders, but instead of being placed in a V, they were literally parallel to the ground. You had six on one side, six on the other side, and in the middle you had a crankcase with your crankshaft and all that kind of good stuff. And the idea was is a flat 12 engine has a very low center of gravity. It's really wide, but it has a low center of gravity. And back in those days, it was sort of like, well, the air going underneath the car doesn't really matter. And so if we have a big wide engine, no problem. I now have a low center of gravity, and that's going to translate to better handling and all these good things. The moment that they figured out, oh, there's ground effects, and we've got tunnels going down the side of the car on each side of the car, and gosh, the more narrow we can make the chassis, the wider we can make the tunnel, and therefore make more downforce. Ooh, I need to have a V12 engine or a V8 engine or whatever it may be. And so if you look at the cars today, when you take those tunnels off the sides of the cars, they're very narrow. The chassis itself is very narrow. And so, I guess my point is that as technology changes, then the mechanical considerations have to change to take advantage of the aerodynamics or whatever it is that they're trying to achieve.
yeah, that's a good connection to make for us. That as the technology changes, the design has to also respond
Yep.
to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that I think we can see it, but we may not realize it
Right.
as the viewer. And so then really it sounds like car design is very critical to the team's success.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that goes into it. You just think about, well, do I have an efficient front wing? Do I have an efficient rear wing? How are my tunnels doing? How's the floor affecting the tunnels? Am I getting the right amount of cooling? You don't want too much cooling, but you don't want too little. What do I do if I go to Mexico City? How do I change the ducting for not only the radiators but the brakes? Right, you got to change that because there's
Mhm.
not as much air to cool the brakes, and so it's just this constant game. In many respects, if you're an engineer, racing has evolved into a game of competitive aerodynamics. Who
Mhm.
can get it right, or maybe who can get it closest to right?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, because when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking the word balance keeps coming out to me over and over. You're constantly seeking to have balance, both in that moment, based on the design that you've done overall, tweaking it based on what's the circumstance, and all the variables that are in and out of your control. And you're
Right.
hoping that your underlying design and understanding of all these principles are correct so that way you can make those adjustments as needed, not to mention all the other tactical strategic decisions that are going to have to be made and chosen that are either within your team or driver's control, and then all the other stuff that happens out. Okay, so then the other thing I was thinking as you said this is all the more the value of free practice sessions.
Right.
Like I am not a fan of getting them. I know this might be heretical to some of our listeners because who don't see it. I think it's the most cool time of the Grand Prix outside of the Grand Prix race because you're
Mhm.
watching them test out the vehicle and see in that what in the assessment of what it's doing, I don't want to lose that, because I think that it seems like it would hamstring the team to get that balance correct for Sunday and putting themselves in the best position to try to win.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as a viewer, it would be so much fun if, I mean, we know when somebody goes out on a set of softs, right? And it's, free practice 3 and they're doing a qualifying sim or something like that. And we go, oh, okay, Charles is going out there and he's got the reds on his Ferrari. Okay. So we know what he's up to. But wouldn't it be fun as fans when a guy comes back, let's say Charles comes back in and he goes back in the garage and mechanics jump on the car? Wouldn't it be fun if we were told, oh yeah, they put in more front wing, they changed the tire pressures, and they lowered the ride height? They don't need to tell us how much of the change they made, just that they had made some changes. This is what the changes were. And then they go back out on track and we see, did they go faster? Did they go slower? It'd be really fun to look at.
I agree. I agree. Because then we would understand more of the principles that are happening. So then we would have a greater level of respect for the skill and the analytics that's happening by the team and the driver.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
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 Oh yeah.
Yeah. I like that.
For sure.
Maybe somebody in F1 is listening. Maybe they'll put that on the screen or tell the commentators to start putting that out there for us. Who
Oh, that'd be
knows?
so cool.
Wouldn't that be fun?
That'd be
Okay,
fun.
so then what are the components that are part of the car's aero that we would be saying, hey, tell us a little bit more about that? Like if we were asking for this and they
Yeah.
did it.
So just a short list. I mean, there's more, but of course you've got the ground effect tunnels, right? Which are just basically an upside down airplane wing that runs down the side of the car. I mean, that's a way oversimplification, but that's kind of what it is. There are obviously your front and rear wings. We've talked about those. But they're certainly critical, not only for the production of downforce, but really they affect your handling balance in at least the medium and high speed corners, and sometimes corners that F1 would consider slow. So they're super critical. There's things called vortex generators, which are basically they look kind of like just kind of like a blade, a curved blade, basically, that depending on where they put them, and you see them oftentimes on the leading edge of the floor of the car, they're used to do what the name implies. They generate vortexes that then create an effect on the air to do something else, like maybe seal off the air that's trying to spill out from underneath the car, or clean up an airflow going into the radiators, or any number of things. But you see them, airplanes use them to trick a wing. They're put on the top of an airplane wing, and they put them up there to trick the wing into thinking that the wing is actually flying faster than it really is, and therefore producing more lift. And so they do that on airplanes to increase the amount of weight that the airplane is allowed to carry. So, they're very handy for those kinds of things. There's a thing called the fence, which is a device. If you look at the back of a car, you can see them sometimes. They're actually hanging down perpendicular to the road underneath the car. And basically what those do is they channel the air in ways that the aerodynamics engineers are wanting the air to flow. And you can add or subtract fences to go up or down in downforce, just depending on what they do. And some cars have as many as 4 fences. So, you have 2, one on each on the outside of the underside of the car, and then one down the middle, kind of underneath the transmission. And you can add them or take them away as the need be. And then last but not least, there's a thing called a gurney or a wicker. And basically it was the brainchild of Dan Gurney. That's why they call it the gurney flap. And basically what happened was in 1972 in practice for the Indy 500, teams started noticing that Gurney was rolling out their Indy car to go out and practice, and they always had their rear wing covered, and they'd fire the engine up, and just before they left, a crewman would reach over and uncover the wing, and off the car would go. And that was a signal to the other teams, well, Gurney's up to something. They don't want us to see what's going on with the wing. And they couldn't figure out what it was until finally somebody really clever spotted this gurney flap that was sitting on the very trailing edge of the wing. It was a little tiny flap about an eighth of an inch. And basically think of a little piece of angled aluminum, 90-degree bend that runs the width of the wing that's placed on the very tail end of the wing. And that little lip basically increased the efficiency of the rear wing by accelerating the air that goes over the top of the wing, and therefore creating more downforce. And so wickers have become like a super big tuning tool on racing cars. And you can see them, on a day where there's a whole lot of air density and all that, you might put a very, very tiny little 1/8 inch tall wicker on the back end. But if you're running in the rain and you need a whole bunch more downforce, you throw that, you might throw like a 1/2 inch wicker on the back and away you go. Indy cars, for example, have a quick release system now set up on the rear wing where they basically, throw a lever that releases the wicker at the rear of the car. And during a pit stop, they'll, pull out one wicker and stick another one in, depending on what the driver is asking for, because of the way the car is acting in traffic, or the track has gotten hot and slippery. And so they need more downforce. So they put a bigger wicker on the back, and they'll do the same thing at the front too. So it's a tuning tool.
I think what I love when I heard you say that story about Gurney and his team is it the size of that thing. Like so small, but yet such a important component that they discovered and capitalized upon. That's so cool. We've talked about the components, and you and I, when we talked offline about this, you said setup also affects the Aero, and setup varies between races. So help us understand that part, looking at these components you just said.
Sure. So, if you usually have two different setups, right? One is what I'd call the mechanical setup, which is your suspension, so you're talking about the spring rates that you're running, which doesn't necessarily mean you have springs on the car. You could, F1 car has torsion bars, but it's the same principle. The effect of the dampers on the car, or shock absorbers, as us Americans call it. In the case of a ground effect car, the lower you get the car, the more downforce you make. And theoretically, the more downforce you make, the faster you can go, because ground effects, they're not free downforce in terms of drag, but they're a lot more free than wings. And so, if you're at a place like Monza, you're going to be running smaller wings, front and rear, but you're also going to want to run that car as low as you possibly can, without grinding the bottom of the car off, which can be done. I mean, great story. A friend of mine was engineering an Indy car at Indianapolis one year, and I keep going back to this, but because of the speeds involved at Indy, tiny, tiny, tiny little changes make all the difference in the world. And they were struggling to get up to pace, and they wound up lowering the ride height like 2/100ths of an inch. I mean, what is that, an eyelash or two, something like that? It was minimal. They lowered the ride height, and all of a sudden the car picked up like 3 miles an hour or something like that. Crazy. So, and 3 miles an hour at Indy is a lot. So, the front and rear wings, of course, they contribute to your downforce, but at the same time, they also contribute to the handling balance. If you have a car that may be a little bit oversteery, the back end of the car is trying to pass you through a fast corner. That's not terribly comfortable. So you could take front wing out, or you could add rear wing in, or maybe a little bit of both, to get that balance right, to make the car a lot more comfortable and ultimately faster through the corner. In terms of that front wing, it gets really, really critical in so many different ways, because how that wing performs in clean air versus how it performs in heavy traffic is really critical. Because if you've got a really good wing in clear air, but in turbulence it's not so good, then you're at an incredible disadvantage. And of course, then you throw all of that in there, and then let's think about going to a place like comparing Monza, which is smooth and fast, and there's really not that many corners, but real long straightaways, And then you compare it to Monaco, where it's city streets, the track is narrow, it's bumpy, they're constantly turning, the straightaways are very short. So your mechanical setup is going to be quite different. Your ride height is going to have to be higher because of the bumps. The car's got to get over the bumps.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the suspension's got to be able to move to comply with the bumps, because otherwise you're going to have tires in the air every time you hit a bump, and that, a tire that's lost contact with the ground doesn't produce any grip. So you again, you're working this compromise. I got to raise the ride height. Well, if I raise the ride height, now I'm producing less downforce, but now I need to go in and crank in more wing at the front and rear, or maybe we're going to go with bigger, more high downforce, high drag wings that are special for Monaco.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, oh, now the wings are producing way more downforce. I've got to go higher on my ride height because now I'm hitting the ground again and I'm losing more downforce through the tunnel. So, I mean, you're constantly chasing things.
Yeah, I
It's a
think it's
Rubik's
the
Cube.
yeah,
You change one thing and you impact three other things.
that's exactly what I was thinking. It wasn't the analogy I had in my head, but when you said you're constantly changing and then one thing then has a whole nother consequence on other. And this is where I do not think that as a non-racer, I fully can appreciate that because it's happening in real time. You're having to communicate it. And different people are seeing or are tasked with different responsibilities. And then someone has to, or as a group, they have to figure out, okay, what is this going to do? Like, how is this going to impact? And is this the right call to make at this very moment? And then you
Mm-hmm.
don't know, as you're in the midst of that decision making analysis, something else that you weren't expecting could all of a sudden pop in. So when
Exactly.
I think where I'm having a little bit greater level of sympathy for Ferrari, because I'm not a Ferrari fan, I'm a Charles Leclerc fan, but
Yeah.
like I'm sitting here going, why can you guys not figure this out? But now listening to you, I have a little bit of sympathy to them of
Yeah.
like, okay, you're trying to juggle a lot. Now, I think you should have figured this out by now. That's the other side of this. I'm not going to just be like, oh, an apologist for everything, but there is so much more happening than we may fully grasp as
Yep.
non-racers, just simply for the entertainment purposes, let alone the what you had mentioned earlier, which was the front wing design. I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's something I appreciate you telling us a little bit more, because it seems like all of this is really about, it's just as much of a art as it is a science, and that
Absolutely.
you have to, and you could even use this as a tactic as a driver of how you're going to utilize the way your car has been designed, or if any damages happen, like especially in the first few seconds of the race when they're pulling out of this, the grid, and they're coming and something happens to your car, all this stuff that we've just talked about is set up and practice and all, it could go out the window. Now
Gone.
you have to now deal with that, and all the more you have to really understand your car and
Yep.
what it can do. Wow. Okay. This is so cool. I'm like so excited because like it's starting to have a little less murkiness in my brain. It feels a little bit more clear. So thank you for that. Okay, you talked about CFD and wind tunnel very quickly earlier, and when I was saying that when you talked about how you all would go forward in your design and putting it in, and then went a little too far and bring it back. But I'd
Yep.
like you to explain CFD and wind tunnel a little bit more to help us understand its impact
Yep.
on Aero.
Sure. So CFD is short for computational fluid dynamics, which is basically a computer modeling tool that allows the engineers working on the car to figure out how is the air actually going to go around the car? How's it going to behave, right? Without having to make the part and actually put it into the wind tunnel. So it does basically 3D modeling, and then it basically simulates mathematically what that piece of componentry, whether it's a wing or an air duct or whatever, what does that do to the air that's either going over it, under it, around it, or through it. So what this does then is that it gives you the opportunity to design an entire car and get an idea of how it's going to perform before a scale model is ever built and then put into the wind tunnel to be tested. So it's an incredibly useful tool. And as you can imagine, it really cuts down on the trial and error piece, because you can sit there draw something out on, on the computer and say, I think I want to make the air go this way. And so you go and you do that, see how does that look? Does it look like that's going to be an improvement? If it does, then you go ahead and make the part. But if it doesn't look like it's going to do what you were hoping it to do, then you can go ahead and say, yep, on to the next one. And the thing you have to remember is that starting at the nose and then going all the way to the back of the car, each piece of the car has some sort of an impact onto the aerodynamics of the car. So, the front wing is not only producing downforce, but it's also directing air around the wheels, which, you think about a spinning wheel on a car going 200 miles an hour, it's generating a tremendous amount of turbulence right at the point on the car where you want it to be smooth, to be going into that floor, because you've got ground effect tunnels that are trying to produce downforce for you. So how do you deal with that, right? And so it's all about how that air goes from the tip of the car to the tail of the car. And so highly important tool, but you still got to put it in the wind tunnel. And the wind tunnel basically blows air at relatively low speeds, probably 220 miles an hour is about as fast as it'll go. It might go a little higher, but it also has a rolling road. So when they put the model of the car in there, it's got wheels that rotate and all that kind of stuff. And it's got like a conveyor belt that basically spins the wheels at the speed that the car would be going at based on the wind. So if you've got a 200-mile-an-hour breeze blowing through the wind tunnel, you also have the wheels spinning at a speed that would be the equivalent of the car doing 200 miles an hour. And then from there, they've got, instrumentation to measure various pressure levels around the car at various points, getting data point. I'm sure there's hundreds of data points that they pull. They also, at times, just to get a better visual image, they'll actually blow smoke over the car to see what it looks like as it goes, so that they can see for themselves what happens to that smoke as it goes over the car. So it's really good. And assuming the wind tunnel is calibrated correctly, then they can go and validate the results of the computational fluid dynamics, or CFD, program that they've been doing. Now, here's where it gets crazy. And where it gets crazy is that if you think about a car, it will roll through a corner, right? Think about, you go into a left-handed corner and the car rolls to the right. We feel that on streetcars, right? And if you come up to a stop sign in your streetcar and you step on the brake, the nose of the car dips. And as you accelerate, the rear of the car kind of squats down. And if you were to go over the right kind of a bump, the car kind of gets light. It goes up, but the tires don't leave the ground, but the car goes up in the air. Well, in each of those circumstances, the car is no longer, if you have a race car and you've got a ground effect car, especially, as that car pitches, you step on the brakes, the nose drops. So now that tunnel is no longer parallel with the ground, or you accelerate and the car squats, as we call it, and the tail sets down. The tunnels are not parallel, so they're not working as efficiently as you'd like them to. You go into a corner and the car rolls. So one side of the car is lower than the other side. So the side that's higher in the air, it's producing less downforce. And then you have the deal where the car gets light on all four tires at once. That's called heave. And so basically the ride height goes up, which means all your ground effect goes away right when you have that kind of feeling in your stomach like you're about to go, weightless or something. So that's where wind tunnels at this stage probably are not going to give you a real world idea of what's going to happen on the track. And certainly, there's calibration and all that. And I'm certain that wind tunnels are going to come to the point where, the car will move around so that they can see what happens. But to my knowledge, it's still kind of a static kind of test. But that's another reason why some people get it right, some people don't. And so anytime that platform moves, the aerodynamic platform of the car moves, the center of pressure moves with that platform, mostly in ways that are not the way the designer intended.
That's so helpful, because I've not understood why, if you're designing using the CFD and using the wind tunnel, why is it by the time it shows up on the track, why are we still confused? But
Right.
by what you just explained, I can see now where there's limitations on the technology to
Mm-hmm.
give you the real world application, both
Right.
in the perfect air density and all the other stuff that we know will impact the Aero, let alone the fact that there is just a level of all the other stuff that could come that changes what you had originally designed or thought could
Right.
happen.
This is why things like the overall spring rate of the car,
Mm-hmm.
how the dampers are working, and you have to understand those dampers. They work in 5 different ways to keep that aerodynamic platform as parallel to the ground as possible. Because the aerodynamics are paramount, and so you've got to have those dampers or shock absorbers working in such a way that it keeps that car from rolling around or heaving or pitching and squatting. That's another conversation.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I feel like we could unpack that for quite a bit. Let me, though, get us to one final question because it's something that I think many of us who watch the race know that it's important, but we don't quite understand the full ramifications, which this would probably be its own conversation itself. So
Mm.
you help us understand what exactly is DRS? Why does it exist? And like, are there any differences in how the team's designed for it?
Yeah, so DRS is again short for drag reduction system. And basically it came to pass just because it is so difficult for one car to pass another. And it's been around for quite some time. The idea is really simple. Remember, we had talked about how you're always playing against drag versus downforce, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the more downforce you pile on the car, the more drag you have, and thus the slower you get. Well, if you could come up with a way to flatten out your wings when you're going down the straightaway, that would then reduce drag and it would send you down the straightaway quicker than a car that didn't make that change. And to be honest with you, movable aerodynamic structures have been banned for decades because they were just flat dangerous when they were first introduced. The idea being that you would have a wing that would lay absolutely flat going down the straightaway. And then when you get in the braking zone, the driver would toggle a button on the steering wheel and increase the angle of attack on the wing. In other words, the front or leading edge of the wing would point more towards the ground, and the trailing edge of the wing would point up towards the sky. And so it would produce a whole bunch of downforce when the driver needed it, which was in the corner. And then when he got out of the corner, he'd release the button and the wing would go flat and you'd be quick as a bunny going down the straightaway. So that led to a bunch of crashes. And we're talking back in the late 1960s. And but it was brought back in a controlled way as the drag reduction system. And basically what is allowed is that the very top element of the rear wing, and understand, depending on the track, you're going to have anywhere from 2 to 4 wing elements at the rear of the car, and they're stacked on top of each other. Well, the very top one probably is running at a fairly substantial angle of attack. In other words, the nose pointing down towards the ground, the leading edge of the wing. And when you get into a drag reduction zone, the driver toggles a switch, and just like in the late 1960s, the upper wing element will go flat. The nose of the wing, the leading edge, will rise and it'll become parallel with the ground. And all of a sudden, a bunch of your drag goes away. So now all of a sudden, the car is, I don't know, I've heard anywhere from 10 to 20 kilometers an hour faster by pulling the wing up. Well, so what happens is that you get to within a second of the car in front of you, and you're allowed to engage the DRS, which the idea being is that if you get a good run on the guy, you pop open the top wing element, and all of a sudden you're going a whole lot faster than the guy in front of you. Maybe it's not always, but maybe that's enough to allow you to pull even and then outbrake the guy and make a pass. Doesn't always work that way, but that's the idea behind it. Where it gets tricky is that the reality is that the car in front is generating an enormous amount of air turbulence. And the closer a guy behind comes to that turbulence, the less effective that front wing becomes. And if that front wing becomes less effective, he's producing less downforce. So he may be going a whole lot faster in a straight line, but he doesn't have the front end stick available to either stay close or to pull out and make a pass. And so it really, really, it helps, but it's not the full solution.
That's really good, because I think we see it, but we don't understand. Oh, it's not like a booster or anything. It's actually adjusting on your car to help it take that Aero component and
Right.
see if maybe you can. But it's not like it's like, I think I had the misperception that it was something that was propelling the car. But now
Right.
what I'm hearing you say is it's actually it's making the aerodynamic and setup just for that few seconds give you that ability to see if maybe you could
Right.
pop in and go. And it also sounds like a lot of this does come back to racecraft and skill of the
Mm-hmm.
driver knowing where his car is, where the other person is, and kind of analyzing, yes, I may be able to do that DRS, but am I actually able to fully execute it? And that's,
Correct.
is that correct? Okay.
Yep. I
Okay.
mean, oftentimes it seems like, you get within 1 second, and yes, they're in turbulence and all that kind of stuff, but they're able to pop open the rear wing going down the straightaway, and they get closer and closer and closer. And then all of a sudden, they're not making any more progress on the car in front of them. And it's because of that turbulence. It's just like, you play the percentages and they're just not there.
And then Red Bull, of course, them
Okay.
and DRS,
Yeah.
out of the a league of their own.
Yeah, league of their own. And in fact, Christian Horner was quoted probably at least a third of the way through the season, maybe halfway through the season, where he's like, yeah, we don't understand why none of the other teams have figured out what we're doing with DRS. Which,
That does sound like a Christian Horner statement.
right? It sounds like exactly what he would say. But you know what? I mean, he's got Adrian Newey, figuring it all out. So
Yeah. And maybe as the team's staff gets enticed away to some of these other teams, they'll all start to go, oh, this is what's been going on. We just didn't put these pieces together. It's like what you said earlier with the gurney. Like, eventually somebody will figure out, oh, there's a reason why this one little thing is there, and that may be what needs to be unlocked. I could keep asking you questions on this, but I feel like you have given us a very good 101 again. And I'm hoping that some of these places where we said this could be another conversation, we will have the ability to have those additional conversations. I hope we'll hear from our audience about that. This is actually a result of some of our audience asking us to talk about this stuff. Kudos to you, Dick, to simplify it for the rest of us who
My
have
pleasure.
no clue. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Shout out to Andrew for your suggestion that we discuss DRS. It's what started this train of thought for Dick and me. And it's suggestions like Andrew's that have shown the guys and me that this 2 Guys, a Girl, and F1 community benefits from the content we're creating. So keep them coming. Also, we need your help. To continue growing in the crowded podcasting world as an indie podcast, we need you, our friends, to make sure you are following and rating us on your favorite podcast apps, as well as listening and sharing episodes with other F1 fans. This episode would be great for new fans. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.